The afternoon sun was low, painting long shadows across the quiet streets of the neighborhood. The shops were mostly closed, but the few people who were out seemed busy with their own errands. Among them was an elderly black man named Samuel. He walked slowly, leaning slightly on a worn wooden cane. His shoulders were bent and his steps were careful, almost deliberate. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man who had lived a long life, full of struggles and quiet days. Nothing about him suggested danger or power. Samuel had lived in this neighborhood for decades. He knew every street, every corner store, and most of the people who lived nearby. But even familiarity could not erase the feeling of caution he carried. Years ago, the world had been harsher, and Samuel had seen things that most people could not imagine. He had fought in a war far from home, in jungles where every step could bring danger, and yet now at home. The danger came in a different form, closer to ordinary life, sometimes in the form of people who underestimated others. As he walked down the sidewalk, he could hear the faint sound of laughter ahead. A group of young men were loitering near a corner store. They were loud, joking with each other, but there was an edge to them. Something about their posture and the way they scanned the street made Samuel uneasy. He slowed his pace, gripping his cane a little tighter. These streets had changed over the years, and the respect once given to elders seemed to fade. The young men noticed him as he approached. At first they laughed quietly, pointing at him and whispering to each other. Samuel ignored them, focusing on each careful step, but as he passed, one of the younger men stepped in front of him, blocking the way. "Well, look who we have here," the young man said with a sneer. "A little old man trying to walk through our street?" Samuel paused, measuring his words. "Just trying to get by, son. No trouble here," he said, his voice calm but steady. There was a tone in his voice that hinted at patience earned through years of experience. The young man's sneer didn't falter. He laughed and nudged Samuel with his shoulder. "Old man, we're talking to you. You can't just walk past us like you own the place." Samuel shook his head slightly. "I don't own the place. I just live here." His eyes scanned the group carefully. He knew that showing fear would only encourage them. He also knew that he didn't want to fight, at least not yet. Not unless it was absolutely necessary. Another young man stepped closer, smirking. "Look at him. Can't even stand straight. Bet he can't even defend himself if he had to." His words were loud enough that a few passers-by glanced over, sensing the tension. Samuel's fingers tightened around his cane, but he kept his voice even. "It's better not to start something that doesn't need to be started." The group laughed at that, mocking his caution. "Better not to start something?" One of them repeated, grinning. "We can make you start something, old man. Come on, show us what you got." He shoved Samuel lightly in the chest. It wasn't enough to hurt him, but it was meant to intimidate. For a moment, Samuel simply stood there, letting the laughter wash over him. He had faced real threats in his life, things far more dangerous than a few young men acting tough on a street corner. But what they didn't know was that Samuel carried more than just his cane. He carried the skills and instincts of a man who had survived situations that would have broken others. Every movement, every breath was informed by years of experience in a world where danger was real. Samuel looked at the group, his eyes steady and unwavering. "You don't want this," he said quietly. The tone was soft, but there was a weight behind it. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't panicking, he was simply stating a fact. The kind of fact that could become clear in a moment if it had to. The leader of the group laughed and stepped closer. "Oh yeah? What are you going to do, old man? Hit me with that stick?" He waved his own hand dismissively, clearly confident. "Come on, show us something." Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, balancing himself on his cane. His eyes moved quickly, assessing each young man, noting their stance, the way their feet were planted, the distance between them. He was calm, but inside his mind was working fast, running through possibilities, options, and potential outcomes. He knew that a fight might come, and if it did, he needed to control it, to neutralize the threat as quickly and efficiently as possible. Another young man moved closer, this one taller and broader than the others. He pushed Samuel harder this time. "I said, show us what you got." His voice carried menace, and his friends laughed behind him, egging him on. Samuel's patience reached its limit, but still he spoke softly. "I don't want to hurt you, but I won't let you hurt me either." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Then the young man shoved Samuel again, a little harder. It was enough to make Samuel stumble, but he didn't fall. Instead, he steadied himself, his movements deliberate and controlled. In an instant, the shift in his posture was noticeable. There was a subtle change in the way he held his body, the way his eyes narrowed. He was no longer just an old man being pushed around. The young men didn't notice at first. They laughed, thinking he was just trying to regain his balance. But then Samuel reacted. With quick, precise movements honed by years of training, he stepped aside, using his cane more like an extension of his body than a walking stick. He used the momentum of the push to guide the taller man forward, off balance and to the ground. The other young men froze, shocked. Samuel didn't strike again. He didn't need to. The first shove had been enough to demonstrate that he was not a man to be trifled with. The street was silent for a moment, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of birds settling in for the evening. The young men looked at each other, their confidence shaken. They had expected an easy target, a man they could intimidate and mock. But now everything had changed. Samuel adjusted his cane and straightened slightly, still calm, still composed. "I said I don't want trouble," he repeated, his voice steady. "But I won't let anyone take advantage of me." The words were simple, but they carried a force that the young men could feel. It wasn't the force of anger, but the force of someone who had seen life in its harshest forms and had survived. The leader of the group scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with surprise. You're crazy," he shouted, though there was fear now mingling with his anger. His friends looked unsure, their bravado fading. They had underestimated Samuel, and now they realized that they had no idea who he really was. Samuel nodded slightly and turned to continue his walk. He didn't gloat, didn't shout or laugh. He simply moved on, his steps careful, measured as if nothing had happened. The young men watched him go, a mix of awe, fear, and confusion on their faces. They had learned a lesson they would not forget, and it had come from a man they had assumed was weak and harmless. As Samuel walked away, the sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden light across the streets. He thought about the world he had lived through, the war, the challenges, the moments when every decision could mean life or death. And he thought about the present where courage wasn't always recognized and respect wasn't always given. But in moments like these, he saw that the lessons of the past could still hold power, even in a world that had changed so much. By the time he reached his small apartment, Samuel felt a familiar mix of fatigue and satisfaction. He had faced the challenge, protected himself, and walked away without unnecessary violence. But he also knew that this was only the beginning of a story, one that would ripple through the neighborhood and perhaps beyond. Sometimes life had a way of surprising everyone, including those who thought they were in control, and Samuel, battle-tested and wise, understood better than anyone that true strength was not always shown in size or youth, but in courage, calmness, and the ability to stand firm when it mattered most. The street was quiet now, but the echo of the encounter lingered. Samuel kept walking, his cane tapping gently on the pavement, each sound deliberate and measured. He could feel the adrenaline slowly leaving his system, but he remained alert. The city could be unpredictable, and he had learned long ago not to let his guard down even for a moment. Every glance, every shadow, every noise mattered, and Samuel had a lifetime of practice reading the world around him. The young men who had confronted him were still nearby, huddled together on the corner. They whispered nervously, casting anxious glances down the street where Samuel had walked. Their confidence had evaporated like mist in the sun. They had expected an old man, fragile and defenseless, but instead, they had seen someone calm, skilled, and unshakable. The realization was sinking in, and with it came fear. None of them had ever met anyone like Samuel before. "Did you see that?" one of them finally said, his voice shaky. He wasn't just defending himself. He's like trained or something." The others nodded, their usual bravado gone. They remembered the way he had shifted his weight, the precise movement that had sent their friend stumbling. This was not luck. This was experience, skill honed over years. Meanwhile, Samuel continued on, passing familiar stores and houses. The aroma of fresh bread from a nearby bakery filled the air, reminding him of simpler times, of mornings when life was predictable. But that was a luxury of memory. In reality, the world could turn dangerous in a single moment, and Samuel had learned to always be ready. His mind replayed the interaction, analyzing each step, each movement of the young men. He didn't need to relive the fear or anger. They hadn't posed a serious threat. But he noted patterns, instincts, and behaviors. Every encounter was a lesson. every confrontation a reminder that life demanded awareness. He stopped at a small bench by the corner, taking a brief rest. His muscles ached slightly from the long walk, but his mind was alert. He thought about the young men again. Youth often brought recklessness, a sense of invincibility. Samuel had seen it countless times in battle and in life. He knew that lessons learned through fear often lasted longer than those learned through words. Perhaps, he thought, these young men would remember him not as an old man to mock, but as someone who had quietly, firmly shown the consequences of underestimating another human being. Samuel's thoughts drifted further back, to the jungles he had walked decades ago. The heat, the danger, the constant vigilance, those memories were vivid even now. He had been trained for life and death situations, for moments when hesitation could cost everything. And though those days were behind him, the lessons remained. Courage, strategy, patience, and precision were not things you could forget. They became a part of who you were, woven into the very way you moved and thought. Back on the corner, the young men were slowly dispersing, but one of them lingered, unable to shake the fear. He replayed the moment in his mind, the way Samuel had handled the situation without rage, without panic. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't fit with the image they had of the world. He had expected weakness, vulnerability, maybe even a comical struggle. Instead, he had seen a calm force, restrained but ready. It unsettled him because it was real, undeniable, and completely unexpected. Samuel stood from the bench and resumed walking. The street was longer than it appeared, stretching toward the older part of the neighborhood where the buildings were closer together and the shadows longer. He moved slowly but steadily, aware of every sound, the shuffle of a bag across the pavement, the distant honk of a horn, the faint click of a gate opening. To anyone watching, it might seem like an ordinary walk, an elderly man moving through his familiar streets. But Samuel's senses were alive with awareness. A young boy on a bicycle passed by, waving cheerfully at Samuel. Samuel nodded in return, a small smile crossing his face. It was these small, ordinary moments that reminded him why he had survived so many extraordinary ones. Life was about the quiet, the everyday, the connections you made even in the simplest ways. He remembered his own childhood in this neighborhood, the games, the laughter, and the lessons learned in small ways that built character and resilience. But resilience alone was not always enough. Samuel knew that. There were moments when action was necessary, when calm observation had to turn into decisive movement. The encounter earlier had been one of those moments. He had not sought it, but he had handled it with precision, ensuring that no one was seriously hurt while still demonstrating the truth of his strength. That was the line he had always walked: protect, defend, and maintain dignity. As he continued, Samuel noticed a small park ahead. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, leaves rustling with a soft, soothing sound. He decided to take a detour through the park, enjoying a brief reprieve from the street. The park was quiet, almost empty, but he could see a few young mothers sitting on benches watching their children play. A sense of peace settled over him, a reminder that the world contained more than danger and confrontation. There was also life, laughter, and growth, yet Samuel knew that peace was fragile. He had learned that in the most extreme ways. In the jungles, in war, in moments of loss and hardship, he had seen how quickly life could shift. That understanding gave him a quiet strength, a clarity in moments of tension that others often lacked. It allowed him to move through the world without fear, not because he was invincible, but because he was prepared, mentally, physically, and emotionally, for whatever might come. As he walked through the park, he reflected on the young men again. He didn't hold anger toward them. Youth often carried arrogance and ignorance, and he had once been young and foolish in his own way. He understood that sometimes people needed a lesson to see beyond appearances, to recognize the humanity and strength in others. Perhaps they would remember this encounter and carry it forward, changing their behavior in subtle but meaningful ways. That thought brought a sense of quiet satisfaction. At the edge of the park, Samuel paused to rest against a tree. He looked out over the playground, observing the children, their laughter bright and unrestrained. It reminded him of what life was truly about. Not the conflicts, not the fear, but the moments of joy, connection, and learning. And it reminded him why he had survived so much, to witness these moments, to ensure that others could continue to grow, learn, and live freely. He thought about his own family, long gone now, and the friends who had not survived the war. Each memory carried weight, lessons etched deep into his being. He remembered the moments of fear, the moments of courage, and the moments where he had acted decisively to protect himself and others. Those memories were never distant. They were part of him, guiding him even in seemingly ordinary situations like the one he had just faced. As the sun began to dip lower, casting longer shadows across the park, Samuel made his way back to the street. The neighborhood was settling into evening, lights flickering on in windows, the air cooling with the approach of night. He felt the calm confidence that came from having navigated danger successfully, from having acted with clarity and strength when it mattered most. Yet he also knew that life had a way of testing people, even when they were prepared. The encounter earlier had been a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that courage could be found in unexpected places. Samuel walked on, aware that the world around him might never fully understand the depth of his experiences, but content in the knowledge that he had acted rightly, with honor, and with control. By the time he reached the small street that led to his apartment, Samuel's mind had shifted toward the evening ahead. A simple dinner, a quiet night, perhaps reading a book or listening to music. The world outside would continue with its noise, its challenges, and its unpredictability. And Samuel would continue too, steady and unshakable, carrying with him the lessons of a life fully lived, lessons of courage, patience, awareness, and respect. As he unlocked the door to his apartment and stepped inside, he allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The encounter with the young men was over, but its lesson would linger in the neighborhood, in the minds of those who had watched, and in Samuel himself. Life had a way of reminding people of truths they often overlooked, that courage and strength were not always obvious, that respect should not be assumed, and that one person, even in quiet dignity, could make a lasting impression. Samuel set down his cane, feeling the familiar ache in his joints from the long walk, but also a quiet pride in the way he had handled the situation. He knew that the young men would not forget him soon, nor would he forget the reminder of how easily people misjudge others. It was a lesson as old as time, but one that was always worth remembering. That night, as Samuel sat in his small apartment, he thought about the neighborhood, the people, and the world beyond. He knew there would be more challenges, more moments that tested patience and courage, but he also knew that he had survived far worse, and that the strength he carried was not just physical, it was a part of who he was, built over decades of experience, shaped by life's trials, and tempered by wisdom. And with that thought, Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the day's events settle into memory, knowing that tomorrow, the world would continue to move, and he would continue with it, steady, aware, and quietly. The next morning, the neighborhood seemed almost ordinary again. The sun shone gently over the streets, birds chirped in the trees, and a soft breeze carried the faint scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the road. Samuel stepped outside, leaning lightly on his cane, ready to take his usual morning walk. There was a calmness in the air, but beneath it he remained alert. Years of experience had taught him that danger often returned when least expected, and though he had handled the confrontation the day before, he knew the memory of it might linger in unexpected ways. As he walked slowly down the familiar streets, he noticed the faces of a few neighbors peeking from their windows. Some smiled at him politely, a small nod or wave acknowledging the quiet presence he had always maintained in the community. Others whispered quietly to each other, their eyes still wide with the memory of what had happened. Samuel didn't seek recognition, nor did he expect it, but he understood that his actions had left an impression, and impressions in life often spoke louder than words. The young men from the previous day were nowhere to be seen at first. Samuel assumed they had gone home, still shaken by the events that had unfolded. Yet, as he passed a small alleyway, he caught sight of them lingering nearby, talking in hushed tones. Their expressions betrayed unease, and their body language was stiff, uncertain. They were clearly trying to decide what to do next, how to act after being confronted by someone they had underestimated so completely. Samuel slowed his pace slightly, observing them from a distance. He had no intention of seeking out trouble, but he was aware that the young men might act rashly, driven by pride or fear. He had learned long ago that situations like this required patience and observation. Jumping in too quickly, reacting without thought, could create unnecessary conflict, but remaining aware, Using the advantage of calm and clarity often allowed one to manage a situation without harm. The leader of the group noticed Samuel and straightened his posture. "He's back," he whispered, almost to himself. The others looked at him nervously, unsure whether to stay or run. They remembered the precision of Samuel's movements, the confidence that had carried him through the encounter. Fear was a powerful teacher, and they were now students unwillingly enrolled in a lesson they hadn't asked for. Samuel continued walking toward them, deliberately slow, his steps measured and his cane tapping softly on the pavement. The sound was subtle but steady, marking his presence. The young men shifted uneasily, unsure if they should confront him again or retreat. Pride battled with caution, and neither choice felt entirely safe. Samuel's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with their jittery movements. He spoke softly but firmly. "I don't want any trouble today," he said. "I am just walking through. You can make a choice that allows you to live peacefully, or one that causes regret." The words hung in the air. They were simple but carried weight, like a quiet force that demanded attention. The young men exchanged glances. Some wanted to challenge him, to reclaim their pride. Others were already thinking of running, their earlier arrogance replaced by caution. Samuel did not move aggressively. He simply continued, steady and unflinching. His body spoke as clearly as his words. He was prepared, capable, and calm. One of the younger men, the tallest of the group, stepped forward. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight. "You think you're better than us, old man?" he demanded. His voice quivered slightly, betraying the tension beneath his attempted bravado. "You think you can scare us?" Samuel paused, looking the young man in the eyes. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said. "I am trying to show you something important. Life is not about power or intimidation. It is about respect, awareness, and understanding. You have to make choices about who you challenge and why. Yesterday you chose poorly. Today you have a chance to choose better." The young man hesitated. He had never met anyone who spoke this way before. He was used to confrontation ending with shouting or violence. Samuel's calm, measured approach unsettled him more than any physical threat could. The other young men shifted, unsure whether to stay, unsure whether to trust their instincts, unsure whether they could outmatch someone who had already proven himself capable and composed. One of the group whispered, "Maybe we should just leave." But the leader shook his head stubbornly. Pride was a difficult thing to set aside, and he was determined not to appear weak in front of his friends. "We can handle him," he muttered. "We just have to push harder." Samuel, sensing their hesitation, adjusted his stance slightly. He didn't move aggressively, but his presence alone communicated readiness. The careful, precise posture of someone trained in combat, someone who had seen danger and survived it countless times, was difficult to ignore. The young men had already experienced the power of his composure once. Now they were feeling it again. The tallest man lunged forward, attempting to grab Samuel's cane. It was an impulsive move driven by anger and desperation. Samuel reacted instinctively. With a swift but controlled motion, he redirected the man's momentum, guiding him off balance without striking him with unnecessary force. The man stumbled forward, nearly falling, and the others gasped. Shock replaced confidence. They realized they had misjudged him once more. "Stop," Samuel said calmly, his voice carrying authority without threat. "I am not your enemy, but I will not allow you to harm me or anyone else to satisfy foolish pride. You have a choice. Step back and walk away, or continue and face the consequences of your actions." For a moment, there was silence. The young men froze, their minds racing. They had expected an easy target, someone to intimidate and mock. What they were facing instead was clarity, skill, and unshakable calm. Samuel's words were not threats, they were statements of fact, and that made them all the more powerful. One of the young men, the smallest and quietest, finally spoke. We don't want any trouble," he said, voice trembling. The others nodded hesitantly, still unsure but slowly realizing that the situation was beyond their control. Samuel's presence was enough to end the confrontation without anyone being hurt. Samuel nodded once, acknowledging their decision. "Good choice," he said. "Learn from this. You will face situations in life where your choices matter. Remember this moment. Respect others. Respect yourself." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of decades of experience, of life lived fully and hard lessons learned. The young men slowly backed away, their bravado gone. Fear had been replaced with a newfound respect and perhaps a hint of humility. They watched as Samuel continued his walk, his steps steady and deliberate, his calm presence leaving a lasting impression. The street, once filled with tension and challenge, returned to quiet normalcy. As Samuel made his way to his usual route, he reflected on the nature of conflict. Violence was never the first choice, but preparedness, awareness, and composure could prevent escalation. His life had been shaped by moments of extreme danger, and those lessons were still relevant. Courage, restraint, and clarity were more powerful than anger or brute force. He carried these principles not as tools for intimidation, but as guides for living fully and honorably. The neighborhood seemed different now, even though nothing had changed outwardly. Samuel could feel the subtle shift in energy, the unspoken acknowledgement of his presence. People who had once overlooked him, who had assumed weakness because of age or appearance, now regarded him with cautious respect. It was a quiet reminder that actions, not words, often carried the greatest impact. Samuel paused at the corner of the street, taking a moment to look around. He observed a young mother guiding her child across the road, an elderly man tending to a small garden, and a group of teenagers laughing nearby. Life continued, full of ordinary moments and simple joys. Yet beneath the surface, the lessons of yesterday and today lingered, shaping behavior and thought in subtle but meaningful ways. He knew the young men would carry the memory of their encounter for a long time. Perhaps it would influence their choices, temper their arrogance, or guide their actions in moments of challenge. Samuel did not need recognition or gratitude. The lesson itself was enough. Life had a way of teaching those willing to learn, and sometimes a quiet demonstration of strength and wisdom was more effective than any lecture. By the time Samuel reached the small park near his apartment, he felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The confrontation had ended without harm, and yet the message had been delivered clearly. Courage, awareness, and restraint had triumphed over arrogance and recklessness. The park was quiet, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and Samuel paused to watch a group of children playing. Their laughter reminded him why he had survived so many difficult moments. Life was to be protected, appreciated, and lived fully. He leaned against a tree for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. The world would continue to challenge people, to test their patience, courage, and judgment. But Samuel had faced the challenges of both war and life, and he carried within him the experience, wisdom, and calm necessary to navigate them. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the street, Samuel made his way home. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, each moment observed. He knew that his presence, calm and composed, had already made a difference. The young men, the neighbors, and even the quiet observers had The day after the confrontation, the neighborhood carried an unusual quiet. Life seemed to move at its usual pace, shops opening, people walking down the streets, children playing. But underneath it, there was a subtle tension. The story of what had happened the day before spread quickly among residents, whispered from one person to another. It wasn't exaggerated gossip, but a shared recognition that something extraordinary had occurred. An old man had faced a group of young men intent on intimidation, and he had done so with skill, calm, and confidence. Samuel, as always, went about his morning quietly. He stepped out of his apartment, cane in hand, breathing in the cool air. The streets were familiar, yet now he felt eyes on him. Neighbors watched from windows, from doorways, and even from across the street. He nodded politely to a woman watering her plants, and she returned the gesture with a small smile that seemed to carry gratitude and respect. Samuel didn't seek recognition, but he understood that actions often spoke louder than words. The young men from the previous encounters were still lingering in the neighborhood. They had not left entirely, their curiosity and pride keeping them close. They weren't looking for another confrontation, but they wanted to see if the man they had underestimated would appear again. They remembered the precision of his movements, the calm confidence, and the way he had handled their aggression without unnecessary violence. The memory of being overpowered without understanding why had shaken them deeply. As Samuel walked down the street, he noticed them from a distance. They were clustered near a corner, whispering and glancing his way. Their postures were tense, their usual arrogance replaced by caution and uncertainty. Samuel slowed his pace slightly, observing them. He had no intention of seeking conflict. He was aware of them, yes, but his steps remained measured, calm, deliberate. He knew that any unnecessary action could escalate the situation, and he preferred wisdom over force. The leader of the group stepped forward, a mix of stubbornness and curiosity in his eyes. He wanted to test himself, to reclaim some measure of pride that had been lost the day before. But he hesitated. There was something different in the way Samuel carried himself, an unspoken warning that this was no ordinary confrontation. Samuel's presence radiated experience, resilience, and discipline. Every movement suggested readiness, and every glance hinted at knowledge gained from years of surviving danger. One of the younger men muttered nervously, "Maybe we shouldn't do this again." But the leader shook his head stubbornly. "We just need to see if it was luck," he said quietly. "He might have just gotten lucky yesterday. Today we'll find out." Pride and ego can cloud judgment, and in this moment they were about to learn that appearances can be dangerously misleading. As Samuel approached, he noticed the subtle shift in their behavior. The group had become hesitant, unsure, waiting to see if their leader would act rashly. Samuel's eyes met theirs, calm but firm. "I do not seek trouble," he said softly, "but I will not allow anyone to impose harm upon me or anyone else. Your choices today can reflect wisdom, or they can reflect regret. Choose carefully." The words seemed simple, but they carried a weight born of experience. The young men stared, unsure how to respond. They had not expected dialogue, calm reasoning, or a moral appeal. They had expected fear, panic, or perhaps submission. Samuel offered none of those. Instead, he demonstrated a quiet authority that could only come from a life that had faced real danger and survived it. The leader of the group, growing impatient, stepped closer aggressively. "We're not scared of you," he said, trying to project confidence. "You're just an old man. We can handle you." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the uncertainty beneath his bravado. Samuel did not flinch. He simply shifted his weight, adjusting his stance in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Every muscle, every movement was deliberate. He was ready if necessary, but his readiness was calm, controlled, and precise. Without warning, the leader lunged forward, attempting to grab Samuel's cane. It was an impulsive act fueled by pride and frustration. Samuel reacted instinctively, using his experience to redirect the leader's momentum. The young man stumbled forward, nearly losing his balance, and the others gasped. Shock replaced their arrogance. They had thought the old man would be an easy target, but instead they saw a controlled, powerful response that left them stunned. Samuel did not strike unnecessarily. His movements were calculated to neutralize the threat without causing harm. He understood restraint, the power of discipline, and the difference between self-defense and aggression. The leader fell back, catching himself, his chest heaving as he realized the gravity of his misjudgment. The other young men froze, unable to decide whether to intervene or retreat. They had underestimated Samuel, and they now understood that they were outmatched, not just physically, but mentally and strategically. "I said choose wisely," Samuel repeated, his voice steady. "You can walk away and learn something from this, or continue and face the consequences of ignoring what you do not understand." His words were calm, almost gentle, but carried the undeniable authority of someone who had lived through far greater dangers than this street corner. For a moment, silence hung in the air. The young men looked at one another, their bravado evaporating. Pride and ego had brought them here, but fear and respect were beginning to guide their choices. Slowly, the tallest of the group stepped back, followed by the others. They were shaken, not just by Samuel's skill, but by the calm certainty he displayed. He had shown them strength without cruelty, control without rage, and wisdom without condescension. Samuel watched them retreat, his posture relaxed but alert. He knew that the lesson had been delivered. The neighborhood had witnessed courage, discipline, and the quiet power of experience. No words could have achieved what had been shown through action. Life had a way of teaching lessons to those willing to see them, and Samuel had just offered one in its purest form. The sun climbed higher, casting its warm light across the streets. Samuel continued his walk, moving toward the small park near his apartment. The trees swayed gently, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. He took a moment to watch children playing, their laughter light and free. These moments reminded him why he had endured so much, why he had survived challenges that would have broken others. Life was not about confrontation or power. It was about protection, connection, and the ability to navigate the world with integrity. He paused near a bench, taking a brief rest. His muscles ached slightly, a reminder of age, but his mind remained sharp, aware of every movement, every sound around him. Even in quiet moments, vigilance was important. The neighborhood was changing, and while Samuel had faced yesterday and today successfully, he knew life could bring new challenges at any moment. Preparedness, clarity, and patience were the keys to facing them. The young men were gone from sight, but Samuel knew that the impact of their encounter would linger. Pride had been tempered, fear had been awakened, and respect had been earned, not through threats but through the calm demonstration of strength and wisdom. In time, he hoped they would understand the deeper lesson, that appearances could be deceiving, that experience and composure mattered more than raw aggression, and that the choices people made in moments of tension often defined them. Samuel resumed his walk, leaving the park and moving toward his apartment. He passed neighbors tending gardens, shopkeepers opening their stores, and children heading off to school. Life moved forward steady and resilient, much like he had. He reflected on the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing one had acted rightly, that one had faced a challenge without losing composure, and that a lesson had been taught without unnecessary harm. By the time he reached his apartment, the sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows across the streets. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling the familiar warmth of his home. Samuel set down his cane, taking a deep breath, and allowed himself a moment of rest. The neighborhood had learned something, and perhaps in subtle ways the young men would carry that lesson forward. Respect, awareness, and courage. These were the truths that mattered, and they had been shown clearly. As night approached, Samuel reflected on the events of the day. He had not sought recognition, and he had not sought confrontation. He had simply acted with clarity, courage, and restraint, demonstrating that true strength was not about size or youth, but about experience, discipline, and the ability to act decisively when necessary. The young men had learned a lesson, the neighborhood had witnessed a rare display of wisdom, and Samuel had reaffirmed the principles that had guided him throughout life. He settled into his chair, looking out the window at the quiet streets. The world could be unpredictable, people could be reckless, and danger could appear unexpectedly. But he had survived far worse, and he carried the knowledge and calm that came from a life fully lived. Strength, he knew, was often quiet, measured, and hidden beneath ordinary appearances. And sometimes the greatest lessons were taught not with anger, but with presence, patience, and clarity. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the day's events settle into memory. Life would continue to challenge him, to test his patience, courage, and wisdom. But he was prepared. He had faced adversity before, and he would FO. The morning after the second encounter, the streets seemed quieter than usual. Samuel stepped outside, cane in hand, moving slowly but steadily. The events of the past 2 days had left their mark, not on him, but on the neighborhood. There was a sense of awareness in the air, a quiet respect for a man who had shown calm courage and precise action in moments of confrontation. People whispered quietly as he passed, casting glances that mixed surprise, admiration, and curiosity. Samuel's routine was familiar. He had walked these streets countless times before, known every crack in the sidewalk and every corner store. Yet now his presence seemed to carry weight, an unspoken reminder of what had happened. Children waved at him from porches, their parents smiling behind them as if to acknowledge that they were witnessing a small but important lesson in life. Samuel nodded politely, keeping his attention on the path ahead. The young men who had tried to bully him had changed since their first encounter. They still lingered in the neighborhood, but their demeanor had shifted. Where arrogance and overconfidence had once filled the space, now there was caution and unease. They had learned in a way that words alone could not teach, that Samuel was not to be underestimated. Pride had been tempered, fear had been introduced, and a sense of respect had begun to take root. One of the young men spoke quietly to his friends. We misjudged him. We thought he was weak, but he isn't. We can't mess with him. The others nodded, realizing that the encounter had shown them something important. Strength was not always visible. Courage was not always loud. Experience and wisdom could outweigh youth and size. The lesson was harsh, but it was real, and it left an impression that would last far longer than any scolding or punishment could. Samuel walked slowly, aware of the young men watching from a distance. He didn't seek confrontation, but he knew that their eyes and attention were part of the process of learning. Sometimes being present was enough to communicate lessons that words could not. He maintained a calm composure, demonstrating that confidence and clarity were powerful tools in themselves. As he continued, he passed a small park where children played and neighbors chatted on benches. He paused briefly to observe, letting the calm atmosphere settle around him. It reminded him of why he had endured so much in life: the protection of simple joys, the care for others, and the understanding that courage was not about proving power, but about making choices with wisdom and integrity. The young men were still lingering nearby, watching. One of them finally approached cautiously, his eyes downcast, hands slightly trembling. "Sir," he began hesitantly, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. We were wrong yesterday and the day before. We didn't know. We didn't understand." His voice trailed off, uncertainty and sincerity battling for dominance. Samuel looked at him, calm and steady. "Apology is understood," he said simply. "What matters more is that you learn from your mistakes. Strength is not an intimidation. Respect is not earned by fear. Your actions, your choices define who you are more than your words ever will." His tone was firm but not harsh. It carried the authority of someone who had seen life's harshest lessons and survived them, and the wisdom to guide others without anger. The young man nodded, relief washing over his face. The others approached as well, their faces reflecting similar acknowledgement. They were beginning to understand that the lesson was more than just a warning. It was a revelation about life, choices, and respect. Samuel's presence had shown them the difference between real courage and empty bravado. A small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather at a distance, watching quietly. They had heard about Samuel's actions over the past 2 days, and now they were witnessing a subtle transformation in the young men. Samuel didn't seek attention, but the effects of his actions were evident. People were learning, observing, and reflecting on the events that had unfolded in their neighborhood. Samuel continued speaking to the young men, his words deliberate and measured. "You have a chance now. Use it wisely. Learn from what you have seen. Life is full of challenges, and the choices you make define your character. Courage, patience, and clarity are the marks of strength. Bravado and recklessness lead only to regret." The young men listened, some nodding, others simply absorbing the words. They had been taught lessons before, but never like this. Never with the quiet authority of someone who had lived through far more than they could imagine. Samuel's presence alone was a teacher, demonstrating the power of calm confidence, the importance of awareness, and the value of restraint. After a few minutes, the young men began to disperse, moving back toward their homes. They walked more slowly than usual, reflective, thoughtful. The encounter had left a mark that would not fade quickly. Samuel watched them go, satisfied that the lesson had been understood. He did not need to pursue them further. The impact was already made. He resumed his walk toward his apartment, the streets growing warmer under the rising sun. Life seemed normal, but Samuel knew that ordinary moments often carried extraordinary lessons. The neighborhood, the people, the young men, all had been touched by the events of the past days. Respect, caution, and understanding had begun to take root, quietly but firmly. Passing a small convenience store, Samuel noticed a few residents chatting, glancing toward him. He nodded politely, and they returned the gesture. He was no stranger to them, yet the events of the past days had elevated his presence from familiar neighbor to a quiet symbol of integrity and courage. Samuel did not seek this recognition, but he understood that actions carried influence beyond what words could express. He continued walking, reflecting on the broader lessons of life. Courage was not about fighting or intimidation. Wisdom was not about lecturing or demanding obedience. True strength came from clarity, experience, and the ability to act decisively when necessary. The young men had learned this, the neighbors had seen it, and Samuel carried it with quiet satisfaction. Reaching his apartment, he paused at the entrance, looking out over the street one last time. The sunlight glinted off the windows of nearby buildings, the city alive with movement, energy, and possibility. He set down his cane and stepped inside, allowing the familiar comfort of home to settle around him. He reflected on the day's events, the subtle shifts in the neighborhood, and the lessons imparted without force or anger. That evening, Samuel sat quietly in his chair, listening to the hum of the city outside. He thought about the young men and the change that had begun in them. He didn't expect instant transformation, but he understood that small lessons delivered with clarity and integrity often had lasting effects. Respect could grow quietly, courage could be understood deeply, and awareness could become a part of life if nurtured thoughtfully. Over the next few days, Samuel noticed changes in the neighborhood. The young men were still around, but they no longer loitered aggressively. They offered polite greetings when he passed and kept a respectful distance. Their demeanor had shifted subtly but undeniably. The lesson had taken root, not through fear alone, but through a demonstration of restraint, experience, and calm authority. Neighbors began to talk quietly about Samuel, sharing stories of his actions with admiration and respect. They had witnessed courage and wisdom in someone who appeared ordinary, who walked the streets quietly, and who acted decisively only when necessary. Samuel had become more than a familiar presence. He had become a symbol of integrity, courage, and calm strength. As days turned into weeks, the young men began to change further. They acted with more caution, thought more carefully about their choices, and learned to temper pride with respect. The neighborhood itself seemed to shift subtly, the presence of someone who had faced danger and acted with clarity serving as a quiet influence on those around him. Samuel did not seek recognition or reward. His satisfaction came from knowing that lessons had been learned, that respect had been earned, and that influence had been imparted without harm. Even in quiet moments, Samuel reflected on the nature of life, courage, and respect. His experiences in the past, in far more dangerous circumstances, had taught him that true strength was measured not by the size of one's opponent, but by the clarity, wisdom, and courage one brought to any situation. The neighborhood, the young men, and the community had witnessed this quietly, absorbing lessons that would shape their behavior and understanding for years to come. Samuel's life continued with the same calm routine: walks through the streets, greetings to neighbors, quiet observation of the city around him. Yet the impact of the past days lingered, not just in the neighborhood, but in the minds of those who had been part of it. Actions had spoken more loudly than words ever could, and respect, awareness, and courage had been quietly imparted through presence, calm, and clarity. One afternoon, a young man approached Samuel, the same one who had spoken a tentative apology days earlier. "Sir," he began, voice steady now, "thank you for everything. I understand now. We were wrong. You showed us something important." His tone was sincere, reflective, and filled with the recognition of lessons learned through experience. Samuel looked at him, calm and steady. "You have made the right choice," he said simply. "Life will continue to test you. Remember what you have learned. Respect, awareness, and courage are more valuable than pride, arrogance, or aggression." "Oh!"